Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, the organizers, for the invitation. So I will talk about the role of nutrition, in particular with focus on fruit and vegetable consumption in mental health. I must say I'm not a mental health specialist, although I'm concerned about my mental well-being in particular. I work primarily in chronic disease epidemiology and cardiometabolic, so some of the topics which have been already covered, in a sense, are also my area of expertise, but I've been interested also in mental health because it's a neglected public health issue, and I will try to convince you that we should perhaps pay more attention to mental health as well. So this is the outline of my presentation today. I will try to provide a broader context on the role of nutrition in chronic disease, and in particular then in relation to mental health, and try also to make the case to look not just at mental disorders, and I will echo what Anna mentioned this morning, that we should perhaps push for a paradigm shift from disease to health, and that will apply also to the field of mental health as well. And I will just summarize the evidence from both observational studies and randomized trials, and you will be surprised to see there is really limited evidence on the role of dietary patterns in mental health, especially from randomized trials which were designed to tackle this particular issue. So that's the kind of conceptual framework that I've been working over the last 20 years of my academic career, acknowledging that the role of nutrition in relation to chronic outcomes can be addressed from two different angles. Obviously, we know from at least 50 years of studies on the role of dietary patterns, and I think we are all convinced that all dietary patterns play a more predominant role in many disease outcomes, but also in keeping general well-being. But we also need to acknowledge that there has been interest in looking also specific macronutrients and nutritional supplements in relation to chronic disease as well. And I think Dr. James has already mentioned about the 7-country study, which for cardiovascular epidemiologists is a landmark study, and the role of Mediterranean diet. I'm Italian, so I cannot refrain myself from mentioning about the importance of this dietary pattern in health and disease prevention. And we do have very consistent evidence from observational studies and some emerging evidence now also from clinical trials on the importance of Mediterranean dietary pattern for the primary prevention, in particular cardiovascular disease. The PREDIMED study, which was mentioned I think 2 presentations ago, has really also corroborated the observational data which we have been accumulating for at least 40 years. But as I mentioned before, there has been also interest in understanding whether from dietary patterns we can, we were mentioning about the magic bullet, whether we can find a key ingredient in our diet which may prevent this multifactorial chronic disease. And I'm afraid to say, and perhaps you already know that the evidence, especially from clinical trials, is extremely negative in relation to the use of micronutrient supplementation in trials, especially looking at mortality outcomes. You see the evidence, if anything, suggests increased risk, for example, of mortality for high-dose trials, with some inconclusive evidence for vitamin C and selenium. And most of my work has been around selenium. I spent a number of years in both US and UK. I was part of a nutritional prevention of cancer trial looking in particular at the role of selenium supplementation in chronic disease prevention, because selenium has antioxidant properties. So there was a lot of interest, expectations in looking at selenium as a potential chemopreventive agent, but also for chronic disease prevention. But if you look, for example, this was a study, we look at selenium in relation to diabetes. Actually, we found an increased risk of diabetes in people taking selenium 200 micrograms for nearly 8 years. This was published about 10 years ago. And more recently, with colleagues from the UK and Denmark, Margot Raymond is one of the top scholars in selenium research. This was from Denmark, PRECISE trial. We look again at different doses of selenium on mortality outcomes. There is a kind of U-shaped association, but you see that for the high dose armored trial, 300 micrograms, actually there is an increase, potential increased risk of mortality. So how can we explain this really inconsistent results, if anything, negative or disappointing results on supplementation micronutrients. For example, for selenium, and it's obvious that people already have enough selenium in many populations just from natural diet. That will apply definitely to North America. So when you have enough of these macronutrients, obviously there will be already saturation of, for example, selenoproteins. So there is no really physiological rationale to supplement, especially among healthy individuals. And we need to remember supplementation was originally conceived to supply nutrients which are missing in someone's diet, as opposed to just provide additional macronutrients when someone already has enough from just natural foods. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind for the way forward. But sometimes we know Americans can be very persistent, so they invested more money, nearly $200 million on the SELECT trial, selenium, vitamin E, even despite all these negative results. And this was primarily conducted among male participants because the main endpoint was prostate cancer, but they also look at the other cancer types. What happened? Well, the trial was stopped after 5 years because there was an increased risk of prostate cancer in people supplemented with vitamin E. There was also borderline significant increased risk of diabetes in line with our previous findings for people taking selenium. So with other colleagues from Johns Hopkins, we then, I think, as a public health physicians, sometimes it's important to take position and say enough is enough, stop wasting money on vitamin and mineral supplements for chronic disease prevention in healthy populations. Again, we are not talking about supplementation in population subgroups who may benefit from supplementation, but we are talking about the widespread use of supplements actually happening mostly in healthy individuals for reason of fitness. Now, again, in terms of nutrition, I think there is then, we can summarize this evidence as a very convincing evidence of the role of dietary pattern. What about mental disorders, or why we should focus on mental disorders? Because we know that mental substance use disorders are extremely important in terms especially with the global burden of disease, and in particular for years lost due to disability, because these diseases or conditions may happen at a very early stage, which means that a large segments of young or middle-aged adults will live long lives with this disease, having major problems also in terms of physical illness, if you like. And again, if you look at the global burden of mental disorders, you will see that in particular the contribution of mental disorders is predominant even with respect to neurological disorders, although there is some overlaps. And in particular, if you look at individual disease, you will see that a condition as a major depressive disorder is the second leading cause of years lived with disability. And if you think about, I mean, there is really very little research in the field of nutritional psychiatry looking at potential dietary intervention to tackle such an important condition in terms of the global burden of disease, such as depression. But you will see there are many other conditions in the top 20 with regard to mental disorders. So I think that's a field that definitely needs more attention in terms of public health investments, and also because, as I mentioned before, the age group which is most affected by these conditions is in the middle age or younger adults, which means, again, that they will carry this disease for decades with an increasing contribution in terms of the global burden of disabilities. Now, but what is important, so from a public health perspective, I think we have recognized that there is a kind of a continuous distribution for mental health. And most of the attention over the years has been more on the left-hand side of distribution, looking at poor mental health or mental illness. And also in this field of nutritional research, most actually the work is done on the disease side of this distribution, looking at the potential effects of nutrients on depressive symptoms, anxiety, and other. There is very little research on understanding what are the determinants of mental health or mental well-being, so on the right hand of distribution. As was also mentioned by Dr. James, Jeffrey Rose has taught us that it's very important if you want really to make a population impact. You should try to shift distribution of risk factors also in this instance of mental well-being towards the right. So you should also make investments to try to improve mental well-being in the general population, just to look at, as opposed to look just at high-risk individuals. And what is mental well-being? It's about positive feelings like life, satisfaction, happiness, and all the other parameters that I mentioned before. So when I was at the University of Warwick in England, we developed a tool, because one problem with the positive mental well-being is that we don't have really the way to measure mental well-being, because we can measure depression and other mental disorders. But so this is, again, is a growing field. And this was a questionnaire which we developed with Professor Sarah Stewart-Brown and with people also from Edinburgh University, called the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, which is a 14-item scale to try to, again, classify mental well-being in the general population. And you see, in terms of statistical methods, you have plus minus one standard deviation, which is the two ends of distribution, either bottom on a high mental well-being and the middle range. So we try to validate this questionnaire in many population-based studies, and here there is an analysis from the Health Survey for England, which covers nearly 1,400,000 across the nation. In England, these are adults over the age of 16, and we try to, again, look at different behavioral correlates of mental well-being. So this was a cross-sectional study, and what was interesting, actually, this was one of the first really study looking at potential correlates of mental well-being, again, as opposed to mental illness. And what we found is that alongside smoking, fruit and vegetable intake actually was the health-related behavior most consistently associated with low and high mental well-being in both sexes. And actually there was also evidence of a linear inverse association, so the more fruit and vegetable you will eat, the higher will be your mental well-being. So I think this was one of the first population-based studies pointing to the role of fruit and vegetable, also potential role in terms of mental well-being. Most of the evidence, actually, both from observational studies and clinical trials, has focused on mental illness, in particular depression, because it's obviously the most common mental disorders, as we mentioned. And in terms of systematic reviews and meta-analysis, I think this is the latest published in British Journal of Nutrition in 2018. There was a previous one in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2014, and results are fairly consistent. Obviously, there are more studies added with this meta-analysis, and in summary, we can see that both fruit and vegetable intake actually are associated with a reduction in the risk of depression. And also, if you look more at continuous measures, you will see that the effect size is not obviously that huge, but again, we need to acknowledge also the multifactorial nature of depression. But the observation evidence is definitely in line with expectations and also with other chronic outcomes, if you like. In terms of systematic reviews or meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, you see there is a number of trials, 17, identified by, I think this is the latest meta-analysis published in Public Health Nutrition in 2015. One thing that we need to acknowledge is that most of these clinical trials were not designed really to look at depressive symptoms or anxiety. These were mostly post-hoc analyses from clinical trials, which were designed for other chronic outcomes, so we always need to keep that in mind when interpret these results. But generally speaking, there is, although not consistent, but there is evidence, at least from 50% of the included studies, that the intake of a better, because this was not just fruit and vegetable, this was all dietary patterns, so improvement in the quality of diet will translate in improvement also in depression scores. So this is the general message from this meta-analysis, although there was also an acknowledgement that we need especially additional trials with enough statistical power to really look at the effects of dietary improvement on mental health outcomes, even among those with clinical disorders. And I think this is the latest trial that I was able to retrieve from the literature based on an Australian study, the SMILE trial, which was relatively small, but where they basically tested a modified Mediterranean diet. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide in relation again to depressive symptoms, and the result seems to be supportive of these potential benefits. So I think this was also mentioned by my other colleagues. What are the potential mechanisms of the beneficial effect of fruit and vegetable consumption on mental health? Obviously, we need to acknowledge that there's several antioxidants found in fruit and vegetable, although I will again draw the attention more to the old dietary pattern, because these nutrients act synergistically, and obviously fruit and vegetable consumption also are highly correlated with other healthy food, in particular fish and whole grains. So this may also explain part of this beneficial effect. Obviously, there are the usual, I will say, suspects in terms of pathways, like inflammation, oxidative stress pathways, brain plasticity, the gut microbiota, which was just mentioned, seem also to play a role in this association. And also the behavioral changes, which may go together with improved diet quality, may also have a therapeutic benefit. And the interesting thing, and for people who are not necessarily within normal weight, like myself, is that the improvements in mental health and depressive symptoms as a result for improved diet quality seems to be independent of weight change, because we always make the assumption that improved dietary quality needs to necessarily translate in weight loss. Well, the evidence is not that consistent, and sometimes we assume it is. So, basically finishing the lesson learned and way forward. So I will not go through all these. I think the message is that we do need more clinical trials, especially in this area, because we have very limited trial evidence, and mostly from post-hoc analysis. In terms of recommendations for application in daily practice, I think there is enough ground to perhaps advocate, as they are doing, for example, in Australia, for the involvement of clinical nutritionists to be added to multidisciplinary mental health team, and definitely dietary recommendations should be part also the first step in the treatment of many mental disorders. From a public health perspective, obviously, we still need to advocate for meeting the recommended dietary guidelines. And also, it was mentioned, the issue of social justice, I think is important also to acknowledge that fruit and vegetable may be a luxury for disadvantaged population subgroups, so we need to keep that in mind in order to avoid widening health inequities. Thank you.